This is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 43.
And in this episode, Daisy's going to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I know we discussed this before I left France, that we were both a little bit dismayed that Brené Brown had moved from Apple Podcasts and every other podcatcher to just exclusively being on Spotify. But I saw this episode listed in a Facebook group somewhere, and I thought that sounds interesting. So I did go and subscribe on Spotify, and actually it's her new-ish podcast called Dare to Lead with Brené Brown. And this episode is entitled Brené with Dr Susan David on the dangers of toxic positivity. And it is part 1 of 2 episodes. I actually remembered when I was listening to it that I've listened to a podcast with Susan David before, and she was mentally on my must-use on Monday Mindset Podcast, and I haven't gotten round to it yet. So it was interesting to hear her speak again, mostly on the same subject, but a little bit more focused on this topic of toxic positivity, which I have actually had a request from a friend of mine a long time ago to discuss with you. So that was another reason I thought, this is the episode to listen to. Dr. Susan David is a Harvard Medical School psychologist. Her book is called Emotional Agility. All sorts of other things she does, but those are the main things she's known for. She describes her life's work as focusing on emotions. That's what she's all about. And she thinks of emotions as being the real core part of us as human beings, and that usually they're shaped in childhood. And she talks about her own childhood. She actually grew up in South Africa, and she talks about it as being a culture of denial, as growing up as a white South African, and a very much of not seeing, and talking about this real disparity, this dissonance with living in a culture like that, especially an apartheid culture, which it was when she was growing up. And she talks about her father dying from cancer when she was still at school. I think she was about 15. And how she put on a quote-unquote brave face on things and really denied her emotions and her feelings. She suppressed them, and she got commended for being so strong. You know, she was told all the time, "You're so strong." And she has a real problem with this idea about positive always being a good thing. This putting a positive face on things when your heart is breaking inside. And she talks about how she learnt to keep her emotions locked away. And for her, how this ended up, because she said, when you bottle up emotions, which a lot of us try to do, they will come out in some way. You can't keep them bottled up. They will find their way out. It's like trying to hold water back. It will find its way. And for her, the way that bubbled up and the way those emotions escaped was eating disorders. So she would binge and purge. And throughout this time, for the months and months after her father had died, when people would ask her how she was doing, she would always say she was doing fine. She was okay. It was in an English class one day, she says, the teacher assigned the class a task. I think she gave them all an empty exercise book and told them to write the truth, to write as if no one was going to read it. And this started a secret correspondence, if you like, with the teacher. The teacher would read it, but it was like a secret between them. And it just gave her the freedom to release all these emotions, to write everything down. And the teacher read her and she felt seen by her. And she actually reconnected with the teacher later on and said how much it really changed her. The experience and the context that the teacher created for her really saved her in this very, very troubling time. So she's really interested in the constructs in society that are supposed to help us, but actually end up making us a lot more fragile. And she talks a lot about invisibility and being seen or being not seen. And like I say, she talks about it in this framework that she grew up in South Africa. She talks about the dissonance and the horror of seeing the things that were going on around her. She also talks about, and she actually starts her TED talk off with a phrase that is used all the time in South Africa. I think it originates specifically in the Zulu language. It's a phrase that's just used as hello, sawubona, but it goes beyond that in meaning and translates more specifically as I see you. And she loves this phrase. I've spoken about it in an old episode of Keto Woman and went in a little bit more to the origins of it, but I like it too, this I see you. And she said this was very influential for her, specifically with the relationship she had with her father. She said that she always felt very seen by her father. And she talks about the importance of people really seeing other people and really seeing themselves. And she talks about it in juxtaposition to really seeing versus this sort of shroud of positivity that is often forced on us by society. She says to really see others and ourselves is to see reality in both its beauty and its fragility. And she hones in a little bit on the fragile side of life and how it's completely interwoven in our lives, and it's an important one of our lives. And she says that the narrative often pushed on us by society is one of positivity and effort. You know, that if only we can be positive about everything, if only we put enough effort into things, everything will be fine. And this is echoing back again to growing up in South Africa in particular, but relates to society as a whole. She says it's a real denial of the impact of what not being seen has on people. And her and Brené talk a little bit how, especially this does relate to women and how women really notice this when they get older. They often equate getting older with becoming less and less visible and no longer being seen in the same way as they were when they were younger. And of course, sometimes that has its advantages, but yeah, the importance of being seen. Her big thing is emotional agility. In basic terms, she talks about this being the skills of being healthy with ourselves. We all have thoughts and emotions and stories, a lot of which are difficult. We make sense of the world with these stories. We need to take in all this sensory information that's around us and make sense of it and develop a sense of coherence. And for her, emotional agility is the recognition that we have all these thoughts and emotions and stories, and the way we deal with them drives everything in our lives. And she says when she was studying, it was really hard to work around emotions as her main topic because it was seen as being too hard to measure, too ephemeral, and there was a bit of a backlash against psychodynamic approaches when she was studying. She said emotions were seen either as too hard to study or an end or byproduct of mismanagement. If you manage things in life effectively, you will have fewer difficult emotions. So there was this whole overriding opinion that difficult emotions were something that you need to manage or suppress. And this is something that she rails against. And she mentioned how Darwin talks about how our emotions are fundamental to our adaptation, just like you mentioned a few episodes back. How emotions aid communications with others as well as yourself. So emotions are not an end or a byproduct, but signposts that we have to understand ourselves better. This signposting is one of the big things in her work, but it's something that I want to talk about in another episode because she has all sorts of things to say about that. But I wanted to go on more to talk about this toxic positivity. And she talks about an exercise, writing on a piece of paper, some emotions that represent how you've been feeling the last few months, something that has been tough for you. Brené mentioned feeling overwhelmed, scared, fearful, weary, confused. And in a world that tells you to be positive, Susan David says the idea is to turn the piece of paper over and write why you are grateful, write why you've got so much more than other people have. And she says this is a forced positivity that undermines your resilience and emotional agility and ends up making you more fragile, not stronger and more resilient. And what it means is that you're not living in the world as it is, but as you wish it would be. And she thinks trying to push difficult emotions away accounts for a lot of the fragility we are feeling, especially at the moment. And she says, when they say turn a piece of paper over and write what you are grateful for, what they're really saying is, my comfort is more important than your reality. And this is where, you know what Brené's like when somebody says something that she agrees with, and she said something like, let me hear an amen in the back, and she gets all excited. And there was a lot of, that's just bullshit. We're gonna entitle this podcast calling bullshit on toxic positivity or something along those lines. You get the picture. She got really quite excited about it. You know what she's like when she gets people to repeat, oh, hold on a minute. No, you've got to say that again. Let's go back. Repeat that. And that was one of those phrases. My comfort is more important than your reality. And that's when she brought up the subject of toxic positivity. And Susan David refers to it as a tyranny of positivity. And she talks about a great example in her own life that is pretty jaw-dropping. We haven't got time to talk about that, but I recommend listening to the podcast because it really was a very striking example. But she says, how many times do we criticize people for not having the quote unquote right attitude, the positive attitude, the positive mental attitude? We force it on people too much. She says there's a tendency to think that if we're feeling difficult emotions, that there's something wrong with us, because everywhere we look, we're told to be positive. But again, she refers to it as this forced positivity. And it's either my comfort is more important than your reality, or she says if you're doing it to yourself, you're gaslighting yourself. It makes me think of, I know we've spoken about gratitude and doing gratitude journals, and I do think there's a huge amount to be gained for that. But it was the specific context that they referred to. It was turning that piece of paper over. So one, when you've been talking about your difficult emotions, and immediately the flip side of that is, right, so now, stop thinking about that now. Now tell me something you're grateful for. Almost, the other half of that sentence. It doesn't work straight away in that context. But also specifically talking about it in relation to something you're grateful for that you have more than other people. And it's that thinking, someone somewhere is worse off than I am. whatever the problem is you're talking about. Well, at least I have such and such. At least I should be grateful for this. It's not a healthy cycle to get into, is it? So I think she's right. When you do that, you're gaslighting yourself. And she says there's no research that forced positivity, also known as denial of experience, is helpful to us as human beings. What it means is you're living in a world as you wish it would be, not as it is. And how do we problem solve and respond effectively to difficult circumstances when we deal with the world as it is? She says it's not about getting stuck in difficult emotions, but being healthy with our emotions. So especially as I'd had a request a while back to talk about toxic positivity, and they spoke about it, I'd really like to hear what your thoughts are on it.
Well, I can say that I have not listened to this episode, so I don't know all of the pieces of how she put it together. I did listen to someone else talk about it in some other episode back when you first got this request. And to be honest, it's an area that I really struggle in because you can tell by one of our recent episodes where I talked about kind of the law of attraction. Staying stuck in those difficult feelings, I don't think is good for us. But I don't think we should deny the experience or tell ourselves to ignore it either. And so it gets complicated for me because I get both sides of these debates. And I can say, you know, in the example that you shared from her, let's say you were telling me something difficult that you were struggling with. And I said to you, okay, Daisy, now you just need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and think about all the positive things that are happening. I think that is just really kind of a crappy way to be supportive of someone. But let's say 2 weeks from now, you were still saying that and still just kind of sputtering in that same place. Then I think it might be appropriate to, as a friend, you know, to try to help you see, where is this going? How will I get out of this? What will I carry from this with me in a new way in the future? Something. But I don't want to be someone who just makes people deny their experience. And I think I've shared this with you before, but it's also a reason why I left the world of being a psychologist, because I felt like overall the approach is let's keep processing the things that feel really bad. And I think somehow, and I don't have the best way to explain it, or I haven't been able to pinpoint even for myself what that means. I think it's something about being somewhere. There's somewhere in the middle that's the sweet spot.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like acknowledging the experience and the reality. Like what you said, something that she shared, you know, when your heart is breaking, you should be able to acknowledge that. It is helpful when other people can see you well enough to see it as well and not say, all right, well, just pick yourself up. It's going to be fine. Yeah, I don't, like I said, I haven't articulated a theory around this, but it's almost like giving ourselves and others time to feel the difficult things, process the difficult experiences without getting stuck there. And that's where I think the idea of toxic positivity doesn't let you acknowledge it. It just says, oh, that doesn't matter. Look how good things are. It feels rushed to me.
You can positive mental attitude your way out of it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like what you were saying the other week about going from one place to the other is too much of a big leap. You need to take some steps in the middle to get you there.
Yeah.
And she does kind of talk about what you've just been discussing with her signposting. But she goes into so much interesting detail about it. That's why it was something that I wanted to come back and revisit in the next episode. So I think actually a lot of the things that you feel that are missing from what I've mentioned in this episode, you'll probably find come together in that part. But to have given enough justice to what she talks about with signposting would have made the episode too long. That's why I needed to break that off and talk about that next time.
Oh, great. Then I will look forward to the next time we talk about this, because it really is, like I said, it's a personal challenge for me. It's a professional challenge for me of finding that right balance of allowing myself and others to acknowledge the things that are really hard. I think we do ourselves a big disservice when we don't allow that, and we do others a disservice when we don't allow it for them. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we stay focused on that too long.
You're absolutely right in finding that sweet spot in between. And presumably also there's no specific sweet spot that applies for everybody. It's a balance that has to be found based on the individual. Yeah. Like you were saying, and I've found that to a certain extent in therapy. There's some value in processing things from your childhood that you haven't properly resolved or you haven't thought through enough. But there is a point where you do find yourself going over it a bit too much and you start focusing on it again too much and it all comes back up to the surface. Very, very difficult.
And like you said, a different sweet spot for different people, but also for different topics. You know, there might be an area in your life where you can process the difficult experience or emotion pretty smoothly and get right back into a more, okay, here's what I learned from that. I'm going to keep going. And there might be situations or experiences that take a lot more work to get to that place where you can turn it into, you know, a gain. Here's the other thing that I'm thinking about is I think of how people talk about toxic positivity. So let's say, for example, you know, like my mom died almost 2 years ago now. I'm never going to look at that as a positive thing overall. Grief, you know, it's a process, but I'm never going to say, oh my gosh, that was a great thing in my life. But there are ways that I have framed it positively for myself in that, for example, she didn't have to stay in a struggle. And I'm grateful for that. I'm not grateful my mom died. I'm not grateful my mom is gone. So I think sometimes when we think of the toxic positivity, it's almost like just trying to make it sound like, no, you just have to have a great positive experience of this. I'm never going to have a positive experience of that. But I can see positives in it.
And there is a timing element, isn't there? Because yes, that reframing of it makes sense. Is that something that would have felt acceptable in the week
right
after she died? Or is it something that becomes a more positive reframing a year or so down the line?
Right.
So that, you know, there are things that become appropriate at different times as well, aren't there?
And even in that moment, I could acknowledge, I know there are reasons why this was the right thing to happen right now.
But it feels pretty crappy at the moment.
I don't feel good about it yet.
And I need to just get through that crappy bit and feel it for a while first.
But if a friend of mine at that moment had said, I know this really sucks, but you know what, Terry, this is really a good thing because look at this and look at that. I probably want to throat punch them. But you're right. There's a timing of when that step can really feel okay. And I think in general, the toxic positivity ignores the timing. It says, okay, that happened. You're right. Let's move on to what's positive about it. And I think we need to give ourselves and others more space to process. And like you said, move on that scale of emotional vibration from devastated to sad, and then to accepting, and then to honoring, or whatever, you know. Let's not go from devastation to pleased.
Yeah. That's too big a leap.
Yeah.
There's also a danger, I think, with some of these popular catch-all phrases: toxic positivity, toxic masculinity, cancel culture, all, you know, lots of things just get bundled up together. And that in itself is problematic, isn't it?
But I'm looking forward to the next time we talk about this because it is something that I grapple with. And so for me, listening to podcasts or listening to people who study these things, it doesn't always fix the question for me, but it helps give me almost like hooks to hang it on or files to put in my filing cabinet so that I can start to make different sense of it.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the second part because for me, a little bit, like I've already said, the first part was kind of two parts and two separate but interwoven things I wanted to focus on. So I'm wondering what's going to happen in the second part. I feel like they're just going to dig in a bit deeper on things they've already discussed, but they might throw a curveball in there and bring up a whole new different topic and throw a spanner in the works. We shall see.
Great. Well, I hope everyone is going to sit with this and look forward to the next time when Daisy shares the rest of this with us.
I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Bye, everybody.